Last night I was distracted from watching a movie by my buddy Jay, who needed a ride to a barbecue, and as a barter, an invitation to that same barbecue. In the meantime, I was watching an interesting movie on TV. Of course I can watch it later on the internet, but for some reason it feels a little different when you watch it on TV. More enticing to watch. But if you can watch a movie on the internet, you can't watch a barbecue on the internet, so I immediately took the car keys and drove to my friend's house. We arrived at Lindsay's house, where her roommates were running around going through the contents of 11 grocery bags. Meat here, condiments there, drink here, and etc. I told Lindsay that I like her new house. It was much bigger, more spacious than her previous one, to which she was a little puzzled and said, "You must mean the house on Nashville Street. I completely forgot to tell you that I've been moving from that house for about a month and a half now." "And where were you living then?" I asked, surprised. "So, he doesn't know about that house?" asked Emily. I just stood there with my eyes wide open, making it clear without words that I had no idea what house they were talking about back then. They called in the third roommate, Brianna, and then Jay came up as well. They took turns adding in their 2 cents, telling some details about the past house, interrupting each other. To avoid turning this story into a retelling of 4 people, I'll tell it in third person. On Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans, Lindsay parted ways with her old roommate and got together with 2 well-known girls from high school, Brianna and Emily, to rent a decent place to live. The apartment was quite spacious, was in a good location, and most importantly, was a heck of a bargain. This house, like most others in the neighborhood, was almost 100 years old. When Emily and Lindsay arrived to move their stuff in, they saw a note from Brianna on the door of the room farthest from the front door saying that she had already taken the room, much to the annoyance of the other 2 girls. For the first 2 weeks Brianna and the girls were all in the house together. It started one night when Lindsay and Emily were asleep and Brianna had stayed up all night, determined to finish a book she had started the week before. Somewhere between 2-4 a.m. she got to the last page of the book, closed the book and went to bed, but she didn't fall asleep right away because her mind was only thinking about the book, as it often happens when you're excited about a story after reading it. It was worth noting that the book was not a horror book, and that she had a pleasant feeling from what she had just read. She got out of bed and put the book back on the shelf while the lights above her began to flicker and then went out. Brianna turned off all the lamps in the room, leaving only the one near her desk on. She soon found that she couldn't sleep, so she sat down again and turned on the television, finding some boring movie on the internet, hoping it would tire her out enough. Suddenly she heard a knock and froze. The girl couldn't tell if it was coming from the door or the wall. Brianna turned down the volume on the TV and walked over to the corner of the room where the noise was coming from. It turned out that it was neither the door nor the wall. The banging was coming from the closet. The girl knew that the closet was against the wall behind which Emily's room was located. Brianna thought it was Emily knocking and went back to bed in silence. But then the knocking came again, and Brianna got up and left the room, but found Emily sleeping soundly in her bed, and the bed was at the other end of the room from the wall bordering Brianna's room. Just in case, she checked on Lindsay, who was also asleep, but that was silly. Her room was too far away for her to hear the knocking, and even if it was Lindsay, she'd have to knock loud enough to get Brianna's attention and wake up the whole house. Confused and a little scared, Brianna went back to her room and closed the door. She turned off the TV, then lay down on her bed and reached for the desk lamp, which turned off before she could hit the switch. The girl jerked her hand away in surprise and the light came back on. She reached forward again and turned it off. The table lamp had ceased to have a life of its own. Suddenly the room was flooded with light. The overhead light came on. Brianna assumed the house was wiring problems, since it wasn't new, after all. And the wiring had hardly been changed recently. In the few seconds it took Brianna to get up and head for the light switch, she felt uneasy. Sure, it was scary, and the crazy flickering of the main light was scary enough, but it was most likely a matter of ouchy wiring. Brianna decided that she would talk to the landlord to fix the problem before there was a fire inside the house. Brianna consoled herself with such thoughts as she approached the light switch in her room to turn it off and end this ordeal for the night. But she began to think that it was not the light bulb that was flickering, but the switch itself, as if someone were playing with the light. For as soon as she got to the switch, it jerked up and down frantically on its own. She jumped back in panic. The flickering lasted for a few seconds and then suddenly stopped. A few moments later, the pounding sounded again in the darkness, but much louder than before. Brianna grabbed what she could and scrambled out of the room. It was already 5 in the morning on the clock. Brianna made the decision not to tell her roommates about it, as she didn't want to come off as crazy. The girl decided to spend the rest of the night in the living room. In the morning, her roommates woke the girl up in bewilderment to find out why she was awake in her room. Brianna decided to say that she was more comfortable here. She couldn't think of anything smarter at that moment. What was even stranger was that the girl suddenly decided to stay with her parents, even though their house was much farther away from her work. Oh, and it meant that the rent would be split among the remaining 2 girls, and that was severely on the budget. It was a long time before Brianna could be persuaded to return to the house, as no strange events had occurred since then. At least her roommates hadn't shown any signs of concern. As the weeks passed, both Emily and Lindsay had family and friends come to visit, but none of them had slept in the house more than one night. They claimed to have strange dreams that they refused to discuss, and that they felt an unnatural apprehension when walking down the hallway past Brianna and Emily's rooms. Lindsay decided to do a little investigating and went into Brianna's room during the day, but at first she didn't find anything strange. However, upon examining the closet, from which as Brianna later did admit to hearing banging, she found that there was a hole cut in the back of the closet wall, large enough for a child to pass through. Emily and Brianna's rooms were separated by a common wall that had their closets. Moreover, their closets were in the same place, facing each other with their backs. The only thing separating them was a common wall. A closer look revealed that the wall was hollow, and the distance between the 2 closets was 3 feet or more. Lindsay shined her flashlight into the small space and found a large coil of industrial wire. She turned the light upward, toward the ceiling, and found that the space between the walls ran straight through the 2nd floor and into the attic, no fence between the floors, and far above, the large beam through which the wire had been pulled. Lindsay decided not to tell her friends about it, at least not yet. After a couple of nights, Emily looked rather exhausted. This she attributed to the fact that she was severely lacking sleep, as the recurring nightmares were constantly knocking her out. The other 2 girls, who had the same problem, interrupted each other to talk about the content of their nightmares, which, to their shock, were very similar. All 3 girls, and as it turned out later, those who slept at their house, had the same dream. A very old, bald man was hanging above them on wires, somehow attached to his back and stretching upward into the blackness. His straight arms were down. His hands on one side were human, but closer to the hands gradually ended in a cluster of wires. This something paddled over the girls at night, waving its arms back and forth as if trying to grab onto something. It felt as if the creature was sinking lower, as if the wire it was hanging from was being pulled taut and loosened. Once low enough, the creature would grab the sleepers by the throat with particular ferocity with its arms, which resembled a cluster of wires. The feeling of strangulation was so real that the girls really found themselves on the verge of life and death. At least it seemed that way to them. When the girls contacted the owner of the house, they noted that he was not surprised and calmly offered to invite an exorcist. This all seemed very strange. The landlord acted as if it was completely normal, although initially, They were sure that the man would simply suggest that they see a psychologist. Although, maybe he just laughed at them that way. Still, the girls called the exorcist, but it was not successful. The creature appeared every night. Salt around the bed, candles and many other attempts to get rid of the nightmare did not help. Lindsay freaked out and said she couldn't take it anymore. Every night she has trouble falling asleep. She looks around out of fear and reacts to every creak. Emily said she would try to find out something and wandered up to the attic. What she wanted to find there, no one understood, but it seemed like a good idea. Brianna opened her laptop and tried to find some information about the house or the street. Lindsay decided to do her part, too, and started calling friends and acquaintances who could run down the history of the house through connections. Just then, a stomping sound came from the direction of the stairs upstairs. Emily came running with a piece of paper in her hands. It turned out to be a very old newspaper. It showed some ragged, dark, obscure picture and the title of an article that mentioned their town. Brianna typed the title verbatim into her browser. An article about an upcoming fair, published 8 years ago, immediately popped up to her. There was nothing else on the site. Brianna went back out to search and accidentally clicked on image search. That search came up somewhere around 10th place with an image of this newspaper, with the same picture, but not cropped. Taking a closer look at it, they saw the hanging man. Emily told Brianna to urgently click on the link to the source of that image. They were indeed see a newspaper published 8 years ago. Polishing the site a bit, they found a detailed description to the hanging man picture. It stated that the hanged man's wife was trying to escape from her husband with young son because he suffered from alcoholism and often raised his hand against her. He tracked down the wife and son, waited until the child was alone and lured him outside. After taking his son back, he left his wife a note saying that if she still wanted to see her son, she should come back. Of course, the woman contacted the police. Hearing the sounds of sirens, the man in a panic grabbed an axe and attempted to chop a passage in the wall, but then stopped, because they would find him immediately. So he climbed into a closet, cut a passage in it and then into the wall. He got inside with his son and closed the closet. The son immediately started screaming and calling for his mom. The man got scared and at first wanted to strangle his son, but stopped in time. He realized that he was turning into a monster and there was no escape. Then he looked at the wire hanging from above. The man put his feet against the walls on the sides and started to climb up to the wire. He hastily tied the wire around his neck and jumped off. It all happened in an instant. After about 15 minutes, the police found them by the boy's screams. The father could not be saved. Despite the landlord's attempts to lower the rent, the girls packed up all their belongings and moved to the first house they could find. They didn't have to choose for long, as they couldn't continue living in that house. This is the house we came to for the housewarming party. The girls, after thinking about it, did a little research and this is what they came up with. In the last 2 years alone, the neighbors of that creepy house have seen 15 tenants change. It turned out that their buddy Brian, who had had several nervous breakdowns in the past year, had been living in this very house, in this very room, for 6 months. Brian was shocked when the girls admitted to staying there. He even remembered those nightmarish dreams and described them in as much detail as possible. Apparently, his condition improved after he moved in. The house is currently unoccupied.